All right, welcome back to Arcanum Theurgy episode 2. We're going to be talking about alchemical symbols, sun and the moon today. I'm Dan Rasanowski.
I'm Joseph Schaefer.
And without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Joseph, and he's going to, kick it off.
Okay, thank you, Dan.
You're welcome.
First, we're here today. This is our part of our series where we're just going to explain some important symbols that occur in alchemical readings and writings, just so that we can understand them for when we eventually start explaining the act, because we have to constantly make reference to them, and it's good to just kind of have a grounding in their meanings and associations. So today is the sun and the moon. And to start off, in the book that we often will be citing here, The Hermetic Tradition by Julius Evola writes, quote, "Sun and moon is the fundamental hermetic duality," unquote. And that's quite true. This pops up all throughout this very book. Also, various alchemical hermetic writings. And the work of Evola itself is just riddled with the lunar-solar, duality. Just to sort of provide a little bit more context, from an ancient text called the Emerald Tablet by Hermes Trismegistus, from which we get the name the Hermetic Tradition, he says, quote, "And as all things were by contemplation of one, so all things arose from this one thing by a single act of adaptation. The father thereof is the sun, the mother the moon," unquote. And he wraps up this very small writing with another quote, "That which I had to say about the operation of soul is completed," unquote. S-O-L is how he wrote soul, which we will see how sun is related to gold, which is what the alchemists strive for. And another anonymous passage from the 8th or 9th century says, quote, "O light which shines to all beneath the sky, O system and bright circuit of the stars, O lunar light reflected from the sun, O sun whose darting beams engender gold. From these the work of every sage begins, to reap in practice some deserving end. In thee appears the object of our search, thou shinest scattering thy wondrous light, a treasure most desired to fill with pearls, and bringing gain and wealth to mortal men." So, a little bit of a broader context and some quotations. Well, let's describe the actual symbol. Dan, do you want to describe the actual symbol of the sun in alchemy, just how you see it on the page?
I do believe it's just a circle, just a plain circle with a dot right in the middle. I do believe there is just a circle, though.
Right, well, that's what I was thinking would probably be our next episode, because we're going to be talking about how that symbol is related to the circle and the Ouroboros and all that kind of stuff. Do you know the one for just the moon?
No, actually. Do you have a reference, a picture?
Well, eventually we'll get into how it can be just a circle with nothing in the middle, like a white blank space, the surface of the moon. But also you commonly just see a crescent.
So it's just a crescent.
Yeah, and there are various shades of meaning in which direction the crescent faces. We can talk about that later on, not in this episode, because we just want to give the sort of symbolic meaning and associations of the broader symbol. Also, you see this crescent pop up in other symbols. For instance, it's on the top of the symbol for Mercury, which is basically it looks like a little devil head. It's a circle.
Yeah, it's like almost like a U-shaped.
Right, the U-shaped crescent on it almost looks like horns, and then it has the cross, almost like a body. Mm-hmm. So that's another important one that we will get to in a future episode. So yeah, that's what the symbols themselves look like on the page. So the sun in alchemy also represents gold, which is what the alchemists strive for. Evola writes that, quote, "The sun corresponds to gold, that substance which no acid can alter." And I believe I have a quote also by Jabir ibn Hayyan. Gaber is his Latinized name, just talking a little bit about gold. He says, quote, "And first of gold, we say, gold is a metallic body, citrine, ponderous, mute, fulgid, equally digested in the bowels of the earth, and very long washed with mineral water, under the hammer extensible, fusible, and sustaining the trial of the cupel and cement." I don't know what a lot of that means. "According to this definition, you may conclude that nothing is true gold, unless it hath all the causes and differences of the definition of gold. Yet whatsoever metal is radically citrine and brings to equality and cleanseth, it makes gold of every kind of metals. Therefore we consider the work of nature, and discern that copper may be changed into gold by artifice. Also gold is of metals the most precious, and it is the tincture of redness, because it tingeth and transforms every body. It is calcined and dissolved without profit, and is a medicine rejoicing, and conserving the body in youth. So that's Gaber talking a little bit about gold. We should probably we'll do a whole episode probably just on gold.
Right.
Because that is what the alchemical art strives for. So we'll talk more about that in the future. But the moon is a little trickier, or so it seems. For example, it has connections to many other alchemical symbols and concepts. Evola writes, quote, "The principle of the moon corresponds to fluid silver or silver water, the ancient name for quicksilver or mercury," unquote. This is a little confusing because silver and mercury they're their own symbols. They're different. They're separate. And I think that one moves from mercury to silver in like the progression. But in that sense, they are linked. And it gets even more confusing when Mercury is referred to as a planet and not a metal. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That always ends up throwing me off.
Well, it's all about the context,
And different writers use these symbols in different ways or in different ways at once, so it can get pretty confusing. And it is apparent the moon is also connected to water, as I will explain a little later on. But water is a tricky alchemical symbol. At least for me, it sort of paradoxically represents thirst at times, and it is also linked with fire. And it's also one of the four elements, which we'll probably have to do a whole episode just on the four elements, that type of thing.
Well, it goes back to what you were saying about how one symbol could mean many different things, linked to many different things, and it's not just as black and white as water means this and that's it.
Right.
It's all about... there's a lot of different context to it.
Yeah, it's confusing sometimes. Oswald Wirth, who is a Swiss occultist, he lived from 1860 to 1943. He writes in his book Hermetic Symbolism and its relation to alchemy and Freemasonry that the moon can also be represented by just a circle without a dot in the middle, a white circle representing the full moon. This can be confused with the symbol of the circle, though, which we will touch on probably in the next episode. When represented as a crescent, Wirth tells us that this represents silver in the order of metals. So there you see the moon being connected with Mercury and silver, and then silver and Mercury being sort of connected and linked. So it's almost like learning a whole new language when you delve into this like alchemical and hermetic symbolism.
Right.
You really just kind of have to sit and absorb it for a while. It's not just like learning mathematical symbols. Like, this means integral, and then you just go, okay,
and then
and then you move on.
There's a lot more to it. It's almost like hieroglyphics in a sense.
Yeah. Well, Evola, he said that, and specifically the symbol of the sun that we just described. He said that's the ancient hieroglyphic of the sun too. So that's related.
Yeah. Okay.
And a lot of this stuff does go back to Egypt, as you mentioned in the first episode.
Yeah, that's very true. I think that's where it kind of got its start, I do believe, or it was one of the origins of alchemical...
and like the Greco-Egyptian sort of connection, and but we could touch on a whole history thing at some point. So regarding a duality, which we will elaborate on in just a minute, Evola writes, quote, "Under a certain aspect, the solar principle can be related to the color red." As we saw, Gaber, he said red is like the tincture of gold, or vice versa. So that was just a few minutes ago. So, quote, "Under a certain aspect, the solar principle can be related to the color red, and the second, lunar, principle to white, referring then to fire and light respectively. Fire is the proper virtue of the solar principle, not the fire of desire, generative ardor, or lust, but the flamma non urens, the non-material principle of animation. Light, per se, is more closely related to the feminine, lunar principle of wisdom, which, with respect to the solar gold symbol, has the same nature as the light that the moon reflects from the solar principle," unquote. Little slightly convoluted, but I think everyone kind of gets the gist of that.
Right. So, before you go on, we were talking about this before. The sun can represent man, male, and the moon, lunar, is female. And that comes up a lot. Do you want to maybe talk about that just a bit? Because that does come up in the symbolism.
Right. That's actually what I have just next. But another thing that Evola has to sort of keep going with what he was saying about light and fire, he writes later on, referencing the Upanishads, that the union of the two gods, the right-hand god is the flame, and the left-hand goddess is the light. So male is the flame, the sun, and female is the light,
right.
the moon. So in the end, the basic duality here is that the sun is masculine, the moon is feminine.
Right.
The sun makes the energy, which is the fire, and the light is reflected off the moon. This is also further corroborated by Worth when he says, quote, "The moon holds out its mirror, which sends the solar light to us. This makes the moon Isis, the mother of all objectivity. The sun, mystic in the manner of Osiris, is the father of spirituality." And then here's just a little table. Did you want to just go through this table, Dan, of just like what the sun and the moon, these are just common dualities between them.
All right, yeah. There's a couple. There's a handful of dualities with a lot of these symbols and stuff within alchemy, as we just talked about. So, of course, we have sun and moon, gold and silver, direct light and refracted light, reason and imagination, discernment and belief, invention, discovery, and then assimilation and understanding, to act and then to feel, to give, to receive, to command, to obey, to create, to establish, and then to conserve, to maintain, to beget, to conceive, to fertilize, impregnate, or pregnancy, and Jachin or Boaz.
Yeah, those are the Masonic pillars. The two pillars are Jachin and Boaz. Mm-hmm. So, and as Dan was reading all that, the first thing he said was always the sun, and the second was the moon. It's just
so it's almost like, they're all just almost like polar opposites. It's like, you think of sun, moon,
right.
Gold, silver,
yin and yang, even.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which, I'm surprised. I should have looked into that a little bit, but maybe. Well, by now you get it. It's a duality.
There's always duality.
Solar, lunar, masculine, feminine, and then kind of related characteristics. The metal relations is where I think it just gets a little more confusing. Gold and silver, if you just know that for now, and then Mercury. We'll have to do a whole episode just on Mercury.
Right. Yeah.
Mercury and water are very important. They come up all the time.
But like you said, gold is like what they strive for. So that's, if you understand that, that's like a really good ground base for this.
Right. So I guess we're nearing the end here, and just to sort of wrap up, I have just some various associations with the sun and gold, or the moon and silver, from Serlot's A Dictionary of Symbolism. Serlot writes that the sun occasionally appears as the son of heaven and sees all, and thus knows all. The sun is related to the hero, but not the father, which is the sky or heavens. The weapon of heavens is the net, the stars, while the hero is armed with the sword, symbolically associated with fire. So again, the fire association coming up. The correspondences of the sun are chiefly gold among the metals, and of the colors yellow. Alchemists regarded it as the gold prepared for the work, or philosophical sulfur, as opposed to the moon and Mercury. So they're like moon and Mercury related. Serlot also mentions another alchemic concept, that of the sol in homine, S-O-L in homine.
So, like light or sun.
Yeah.
Fire.
Yeah, not as in like the human soul.
Right.
Or the invisible essence of the celestial sun, which nourishes the inborn fire of man. He also says that according to René Guénon, the Latin word for gold, aurum, aurum nostrum non est aurum vulgi, our gold is not the common gold. Aurum is the same as the Hebrew for light, which is spelled A-O-R. That's a little confusing to me, going after what we just said before, but basically that these words are related, connected in some sense, according to Guénon, is that, but as we said, light is more associated with, that's just the direct light. See, this is where I just get confused sometimes. I think I have it figured out, but I think it's because I'm being too rigid. I want to be like, this is that. But we gotta remember, like, we're forgetting, like, this is part of the interesting thing, and why I want to learn so much about this is because I want to adopt that mindset that is basically forgotten to us. As modern people, we don't have these same sort of thought processes anymore.
More than meets the eye.
Yeah, more than meets the eye.
Reality,
not just material,
yeah.
and actually realizing what a symbol is. Like we were talking yesterday, today people just view a symbol as like an agreed upon representation,
of something.
Like the cross, like 2 plus 2. That plus sign, it means you add them together. We all agree on that. Like.
But
But then there's the symbolism of the cross and like alchemy and hermeticism, which it represents the 4 elements. It also represents the quintessence in the middle. It represents the heart. It can represent man. It can represent many
that's
things.
Very true. You ask anybody, and they say, "Well, that's a plus sign."
And it's not just a representation. It's a symbol. And that we could talk about this another time. I should have done some research. I didn't realize this would come into my head though about like. The symbol, it's not just a representation. It's something that aids you to get directly to a principle. I believe I'm correct in saying it's similar to like icons in Orthodox Christianity. Okay. So they're not just pictures. They're not just a representation. It's the gateway to the ideal
like
or the principle.
Meaning of something. It's not just in
a sense.
Yeah.
So getting back to Serlo. Lastly, he writes of gold and the sun, quote, "Gold is the image of solar light and hence of the divine intelligence. If the heart is the image of the sun and man, in the earth it is gold." So this is unquote, sorry. This is hearkening back to the quote I read about metals in our first episode, so just maybe a little tie-in there. So moving on to the moon / silver, Serlo has lots to say about the moon. Like he goes on for... I would say the average entry in his Dictionary of Symbolism has like maybe a half a page, but the moon goes on for like 3 or 4 pages. And then he also has a separate entry for the tarot card, the moon. So he has a lot to say about the moon, but for what interests or concerns us here in alchemy and hermeticism, he points to the relation between the moon and the tide, thus a link between the moon and waters, or water, and then from there, Mercury. He also points to the connection of the moon of Earth and the connection between the lunar cycle and the physiological cycle of women, menstruation, so thus connecting to femininity. He points out that the metal corresponding to the moon is silver and that it is regarded as the occult side of nature, as opposed to the sun, which is responsible for the life of the manifest world and for fiery activity. That's another thing. Another sort of polarity is the sun is usually the active principle while the female is the passive. And this also just comes through in the sense that the sun creates the energy, which it shines out. So that's the active, which is just reflected on the passive feminine moon.
From the moon.
The moon,
right.
Yeah. He adds, quote, "In alchemy, the moon represents the volatile or mutable and feminine principle, and also multiplicity because of the fragmentary nature of its phases," unquote. So that may also tie into what I said earlier about how, depending on which way the crescent is facing, there's a bit of a different meaning there, because then, again, like he just said, the cycle of the moon is a fragmentary nature, like you see bits and pieces of it as it goes through its phase,
Then it means different things.
Right. Did you have anything to add just before I kind of say a little pitch about our next episode, what it's going to be?
Not too much. I just like with the sun and the moon, of course, that comes up in the occult too. A lot of rituals,
right?
Like when you make a circle, a ritualistic circle for purposes of divination, or trying to contact a spirit, or just do some sort of, I guess you could say, quote unquote, spell. You do see the sun and the moon symbolized within the circle as a means to channel energy quite often, because like you said, you want the light and then you want the refracting light from the moon. It's all just like, here's the energy into the ritual, and then here's the light being reflected off of that, and then you're getting a it's hard to say. You're getting a result.
Yeah.
You're getting a result. So the sun's giving the energy to the ritual, the moon's reflecting it. You're getting a result. So then you get what you need. So, which when we get into all of that, I will talk about that more. But it does come up there as well. So sun and the moon, I guess, in short, are very, very important. So you will see that a lot.
Yeah, and I mean, I was looking through your you have the Agrippa book, books on occult philosophy, and I know, he has specific chapters just like on the sun, on the moon, or on things solar, on things lunar. I want to say, as far as animals are concerned, I remember reading that he said like the hawk is a solar animal,
right?
A certain type of cat called the Kuiper or Cyper cat, Ciper cat, was lunar.
I think it's Cyper
cat, yeah. So stuff like that. There's animal connections, plant connections, and the occult side. They seem to deal far more with like vegetative things in the occult.
It's more.
Whereas like here, we're very like. The alchemical stuff is very spiritual and cosmologic.
Exactly.
So
then
go ahead.
I was just going to say, you're right. The occult's more physical. They do take plants and stuff like that. That means,
and even like
things.
And like blood and I mean, not saying like killing people, but I mean, I've read little recipes for like certain things, or scents can be very important. Like you want to use certain scents for certain
smells,
things.
exactly.
Yeah. So
and by blood, it doesn't necessarily mean killing people, though. I'm sure in the past,
or even just sweat. So you can like create conditions that will make you sweat, just so
or
you
tears.
have that. Yeah, tears.
It's
right.
and I mean, you might think, well, it's just water and it doesn't matter, but it's like it's where it's coming from that makes a difference.
It's a big deal. Yeah.
And blood, sometimes they'll cut their arm a little bit. It gets like that. It's more of a literal representation, as where the alchemy, like you said, is spiritual. But that's of course, like many things we're talking about, that's for a later time. We'll get into that. Don't worry, because I'm sure some people are very interested in the more physical practice of both of these things. But yeah,
right. Well, with that said, considering, I think it might be logical to move on in our next episode. We can talk just about broadly the circle, so you can bring in more detail from the occult side for the listeners, and I will talk about, I know Worth has some interesting passages about the circle, and he really delves into the meaning, that the things that are expressed by the circle and with the dot in the middle. So I mean, really delving into like the etymology in a sense of the symbol.
Super important.
And it's also related to then the famous Ouroboros, the snake eating its own tail, which is related to Entopan, one the all. So we could talk about that kind of stuff. Yeah, so we'll just have to do a little research and homework, and I guess report back next week, huh?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I guess that's it for now.
All right, well, thanks for tuning in once again. We really appreciate it. We'll see you guys next week. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more on the circle, as we said. We'll really try to really enlighten you, and we'll really talk about the symbol itself, the actual symbol. But with that being said, thanks again for watching, listening. Forgot we're a podcast now. I'm Dan Rasanowski.
I'm Joe Schaefer.
And, we'll see you guys next week.